What is up, my fellow gamers? Have you ever wondered what happens to the spaceships running your empire in the background when playing a game like Stellaris? Or, perhaps more relevant here, what happens inside the mothership when salvaging enemy spacecraft in Homeworld? Or are you perhaps curious about a more grounded and realistic-ish future setting of a solar system buzzing with interplanetary commercial flights? More specifically from the viewpoint of a blue-collar wage slave? Then Hardspace Shipbreaker is the game for you. Now, why is it called Hardspace Shipbreaker and not just Hardspace or Shipbreaker? Well, that's a surprisingly long story, but to make it short, Blackbird Interactive, the studio behind Homeworld Deserts of Karak, was working on a game idea before they actually had the Homeworld IP to work on. That game was initially called Hardware Shipbreakers, which already had the desert setting, but focused more on salvaging ships in the desert more than anything else. Eventually, Deserts of Karak was made on its foundations, and the Shipbreaker name was applied to a new idea, that being a shipbreaker in space. Shipbreakers exist in the real world, and were a large inspiration for this game. In India especially, workers break down and salvage massive ships in dangerous and abominable working conditions, which is echoed in the story of Hardspace Shipbreaker. In any case, Hardspace Shipbreaker kind of has its origins in the Homeworld universe, and those roots can still be found in stuff like the architecture of certain things, like this gantry in the main menu, and just the overall look and feel of all these space marvels. But Hardspace Shipbreaker is not set in the Homeworld universe at all. It is instead set in the not too distant future, about 300 years in fact, in a solar system where Earth, after colonizing Mars and kickstarting interplanetary trade and infrastructure, turned into a piss-poor shit-ass backwater, which seems to be largely caused by the Kessler Divide, a manifestation of the dreaded Kessler Syndrome, where launching spacecraft from the ground is prohibitively expensive due to a blanket of space junk and debris covering the entire globe. And it's like that one anomaly, an endless space. Yeah, good luck getting off of that planet, losers. You play as a random schmuck on this dystopic Earth, just being accepted into the Lynx Salvage program. Lynx being, drumroll please, an evil megacorporation. Through their de facto monopoly on space travel through their railgate network, it is in fact Lynx who hold the most power in the solar system. Lynx also has first dibs on every single spaceship that needs to be salvaged, be it because the company running these ships went bankrupt, the ships themselves broke down, or they were found drifting lifeless through the frontier.
Found her floating. No one aboard, no distress signals. Manifest been completely wiped. It's like they took a long walk, never came home.
Lynx employs people like you into their Everwork program, backing up your genetic data so that in the case of an untimely demise by getting crushed, burned, asphyxiated or blunt force traumatized, they simply copy your consciousness into a new spare clone, give you a little finger wag, charge you 150k for the service and put you back into the field almost instantly. That shift isn't gonna finish itself, of course. A slight tangent here. It was not entirely clear to me how exactly this consciousness transferring process works. If you've ever played Soma before, you know that copy and paste is definitely not the same as cut and paste when it comes to consciousnesses. But either it is cut and paste here, or none of the other workers are suspicious about it. But if this is actually copy and paste, which is the most likely, it makes Lynx even more evil than it already is, because it's literally just killing you and replacing you with a clone every single time. And with the way you literally get killed at the start of the game, it definitely skews it in that way.
Beginning extractions now.
In any case, salvaging spaceships can be pretty dangerous. While you start out at hazard level 1, as you progress through the game and become more proficient at shipbreaking, the hazard level of these ships steadily goes up to level 9. These hazardous ships often have pressurized areas, explosive fuel tanks, unstable electric systems, reactors capable of melting down, and even little AI barnacles messing with the airlocks. That's all they do, except from warping the voice of your suit and turning off your radio so you have no music. So scary. ChatGPT will surely kill us all. Visually, the game looks pretty good in my opinion. Like I said, the art style is somewhat inspired by Homeworld, and all the ships you salvage have a very blocky and pragmatic look to them, even the more luxurious station hoppers. One thing I don't like very much myself is how absolutely everything looks like it was made by the same manufacturer. And I'm not talking about the ships themselves, but rather what's in them. Components like airlocks or reactors being the same is fine, but every computer terminal looks the exact same too. Every panel, even between ship types and ship manufacturers. While this allows for you to recognize everything visually quite easily, it becomes quite mundane after a while. But aside from that small nitpick, the stuff you work on looks good, and the wider environment outside your bay also looks very nice, with the local railgate being this technological marvel of hope and freedom, while also functioning as the projector of power of links. Pretty cool vibes overall.
Whew, what a beauty.
Audio-wise, and when I mention audio specifically, you know it's special. This is something interesting for sure. As you probably know, there is no sound in space, as there's no medium for sound waves to travel through. Things still make sound in space, but it simply has nowhere to go. This makes it so that, at the start of the game at least, the only sounds you hear are those of things directly connected to your character, be it the hum of your laser cutter or the droning of your grapple, or simply the radio or breathing inside of your helmet. Eventually, you can buy an upgrade for your suit that provides audio resynthesis or something along those lines, which allows you to hear faint noises of stuff like the hiss of a leaking fuel pipe or the pop of a cutting point, or at least hear them more clearly. While I didn't explicitly notice this during my gameplay, when I actively listened for it, it does add another layer of sounds to a relatively quiet game, which is pretty cool to see, or hear rather. What is also a nice detail is that whenever you're inside of a pressurized area inside of a ship, the entire soundscape sounds a lot less muffled. On the rare few occasions I did use my tools inside of a pressurized area instead of just looking for an atmosphere regulator to depressurize it, this definitely added that extra layer of detail on top of everything. It's all very authentic sounding too. The music is also pretty cool. Most of it certainly has a vibe that fits very well with the game. I don't think it's exactly like Wild West mining town vibes or anything, but it does kind of have this Rust Belt vibe to it, and looking it up seems to confirm it to be Americana inspired, so that's what it is, I guess. I don't know exactly, but regardless, it is pretty chill music to work and salvage to 24/7 live stream.
That's 1 minute left on the clock, Cutter. 1 minute left.
Now, For the privilege of allowing you to work on these ships, which are worth a pretty penny in salvage and raw materials, you have to pay a little bit up front, of course. You have company-mandated housing, food, training, as well as needing to rent out your tools, suit and workspace. Oxygen or thruster fuel isn't free either, of course. So, at the start of the game, you get settled with just a little bit of debt to work off before you actually start to earn your own money. That's no big deal, it's only 1,252,594,441.92 credits after all. Here is where the first problem starts, the disconnect between the world and story on the one hand and the gameplay on the other, but I'll get more into this later. Let me first sketch you how the game actually plays. The vast majority of your time playing you spend out in your salvage bay. This zero-G environment is what makes it possible to deconstruct and salvage these bigger and bigger ships by yourself, and watching parts drift around after you start dismantling these ships never gets old. The physics here certainly feel very believable, though one thing to keep in mind is that these parts don't behave as if they're in a complete vacuum. You as the player never seem to lose momentum unless you're actually using your thrusters, as you'd expect, but a ship part you've launched at a processor at relatively low speeds seem to not always make it to their destination, especially if they're a large mass, often needing a small push to get them moving again. But this, combined with some objects being flammable and whatnot, makes me think there's like a mini atmosphere or whatever here. I don't really care enough to bother that much, but this is probably a good thing anyway, since in the case you rip away something you didn't mean to, or just lose track of something, you can count on it to usually still be vibing around your workspace instead of adding to the Kessler divide. You are armed at the start of the game with 2 tools and a third one being unlocked about halfway through the game. These 2 original tools are your grapple and your cutter, with the third tool being demolition charges. Your grapple is essentially a more dangerous version of the gravity gun in Half-Life 2, pulling stuff towards you, force pushing lighter objects away from you, and later unlocking the ability to put tethers between objects. These tethers are a lot stronger than your grapple and allow you to move massive parts you couldn't move without them. Your laser cutter is needed to actually break up the ships into manageable parts, either by cutting through cutting points or cutting through aluminum panels. You can also fire a precision laser to destroy single parts through pure heat, which is usually a good idea if you want to get a cutting point without destroying any objects near it, like cutting through some valuable electronics by accident, for example. The demolition charges are basically a more powerful and unpredictable version of the laser cutter and are needed for very specific grade 3 cutting points. They can also help in cutting up a ship a bit faster, but in general they're not really that useful. The controls in general here, with a mouse and keyboard at least, feel very floaty, which is apt, I suppose. If I played a few hours of Hardspace and then played something else and then come back to Hardspace in the same day, it was very noticeable how finicky and floaty just aiming these tools feels. This feeling does go away after a few minutes when you get used to it, but this could vary from person to person and I could see it be a real issue for some. The entire salvaging process is relatively straightforward here, but it really differs from ship type to ship type. Once you start getting those pressurized ships, your priority should be trying to depressurize the ship in a manageably safe way, as cutting it to compartments that are pressurized could result in some hijinks ensuing.
The systems mode of your scanner.
Even then, atmosphere regulators aren't everywhere on a ship and they don't always work either. But it's usually a good idea to focus on depressurizing stuff inside of the ship before dismantling the reactor, because otherwise those airlocks won't be powered anymore and you could get knocked out by some random piece of debris flying into your face. But in general, the whole thing is quite simple. Cut the ship apart by destroying cutting points, then grapple or tether the piece into the correct receptacle. The processor for nanocarbon and more advanced stuff, the furnace for aluminum and other simple stuff like glass, and the barge for stuff that is still useful as is, usually furniture or electronics like seats or computer terminals. The challenge here being to dismantle the ship well enough so you can get stuff out of it, like blowing off a floor panel to punt all the passenger seats into the barge, without destroying a lot of the valuable stuff or putting it into the wrong receptacle in the process. A big part of the personal skill progression in this game is realizing what to cut when and how detailed to cut things, especially if you want to be somewhat efficient. You can move multiple panels still together with tethers. Certain smaller components aren't worth it to actually separate either. Like, sure, a computer worth 150k credits, better take that to the barge. But all those lights that are worth like 3000, don't bother. The margin of error is pretty wide here for the highest salvage goal, and the real maximum percentage the game expects from you is 95%, for which you get a little sticker. The way you progress through the game makes it so every new ship usually feels different and interesting enough, with you regularly unlocking new ship types or classes and variations on those existing types, like a cargo variant, a passenger variant, and a science variant of the same ship, for example. The hazard levels keep you on your toes, with Type 2 reactors requiring the most attention and caution, with fuel tanks causing me a lot of grief as well, when half the ship just explodes because you cut too close to a live fuel line.
Fire damage.
All of these different hazards do prevent you from rushing through a ship and require you to do things more methodically. To have as big a window as possible for removing a Type 2 reactor, for example, you need to decouple the thrusters and the ECU or environmental control unit. Decoupling the ECU is no big deal, just remove the coolant tanks inside of it, but decoupling the thrusters requires them to be powered to actually flip the switch. So you should always prioritize flipping this switch before you start cutting the ship apart and removing those power connections as a result. This can become a tad tedious over time, depending on how sensitive you are to things like this and how much you play in a short time frame. This also applies to the shift timer you get from the second difficulty level up, with it often feeling more tedious than it does challenging. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go on a 2-hour video essay spiel on the intricacies of difficulty versus challenge and tedium or anything along those lines, but I will come back to this later to give my opinion on it. Before that, I'd like to talk about a part of the game that isn't played in Salvage Bay, but in your hab. Between shifts, this hab is your cozy home away from home, with such amazing amenities like a bed, food, probably customizable posters, possibly a toilet, and, best of all, a window to look through sad and longingly at the universe.
Maybe bring my old man along to help sniff out the good rocks.
It's here in the hab that you can upgrade and repair your tools, as well as read messages you get. Later on, you also get to decode data drives you find in ships and look through those, as well as repair your very own ship, which you are graciously gifted by Weaver, the overseer/tutorial guy of your sector. And that's about it. Just some stuff to check on in between shifts. Upgrading your gear requires not money, but links tokens, which you earn by hitting those salvage goals for every ship. While repairing your tools does cost money, but you need to either get tool repair kits as rewards for those salvage goals, find them in the ships themselves, or just buy them during your shift at kiosk. This entire tool repairing mechanic does feel kind of tagged on, especially because you actually have to buy the kits with money, and money doesn't matter at all in the game, so it is a bit of a useless addition in my opinion. After doing all you need or want here in the hab, all that's left is to go back to your shift. Pick a new ship from a random list of about 10, or continue working on your previous ship that still has some salvage goals to tick off. Then do 15 minutes of salvaging, messing up, accidentally blowing stuff up, pulling objects too fast to you, shattering your skull, accidentally drifting too close to the furnace, etc. Then you end your shift, go to sleep, wake up to your daily 500,000 bill of costs, and get to it once again. So you're really on that grind. After finishing your shift, oftentimes you'll get an unskippable call. Making stuff like this unskippable is just not fun, by the way. While I do respect and almost always engage with the story in games, even if I don't like it, I realize and accept this is not for everyone, and making stuff like this absolutely unskippable is just not good game design, unless it's actively tied to the gameplay, of course. Even making it unskippable for the first playthrough, for example, I would accept, or just making it an option at the start or whatever. But now I just have to alt-tab for a few minutes because I've already played through the entire story, which is just not fun, you know. Anyways, this unskippable call is usually from Lou, which progresses the story in the background. The only active way to progress this story is by ranking up your certification level by just hitting salvage goals. So it's completely linear and in a way more background noise than anything else. The story itself is fine, nothing special.
So this can be an awkward subject, but you've probably noticed Lynx doesn't take great care of us. Up until maybe 100 years ago, workers like us would sometimes form these groups called unions and go toe-to-toe with the company.
Lou invites you into a union-type news group, which is against your contract because unions are illegal. Then, an administrator gets sent to your sector to stamp out those commie unionizers, which eventually ends in a huge scandal and the solar government actually being useful for once and slightly raising workers' rights and improving their contracts, as well as mandating Lynx to basically forgive $1 billion of your $1.25 billion debt. That's it basically when it comes to story. There are some cool moments in-game.
We'll give you work so dangerous you'll revive 20 times a day until your DNA comes apart at the seams. And when you come back as a useless, gibbering blob, we'll make your family pick up the bill.
And I really like Weaver as a mentor-type character who tries to do everything by the books while still caring for his crew. Making Lynx and the administrator evil is a given, but I would have liked a more unique take on this maybe. It is obviously very predictable, though it was interesting to see, after the end of the main story, that this new age of the Union isn't all sunshine and rainbows either, with conversations between Didi and Lou arguing about whether a union is even that good of an idea in the first place. And this makes it come off as not too skewed into the anti-capitalist direction or pro-communist direction, you know. I'm all for unions myself, by the way, living in Western Europe as I do, but this is just a bit of an aside. The real ending is whenever you fix up your ship and can leave. And the cutscene here is absolutely gorgeous. I really like the art style here. Same for this story intro cutscene, by the way. And even after this true ending, you can just keep playing on that save to do whatever you want. Get to certification level 30, finish up some achievements, complete your sticker collection, fully upgrade all your tools, get all of the data drives, whatever. Sadly, you have to do that without Weaver being your friendly shift manager. There's nothing wrong with Didi, but I did miss Weaver at the end there.
Well, in the meantime, you got me. Quit shooting the breeze and get back to work.
Didi, I'm gonna enjoy giving you a hard time.
Ain't a tray like it. Dancing between the ribs of a ship, spitting heat, do-si-doing with a 10-ton panel, taking a breather. Gaze out at the rest of the human race, buzzing in the distance. Huh. Can you tell I miss it?
Like I said, the story is serviceable, and the most interesting parts about the writing are found in these data drives you can decode, with a lot of mystery surrounding the frontier, where the AIs and the machine god leading the AIs are, or something along those lines, with some nefarious plots or whatever. Other stuff you can find in those data drives is just more personal details and accounts about the life of various space travelers, or the history of space travel, you know, cool little lore nuggets like that. Some background gets mentioned by the other NPCs here and there, and they paint a consistently bleak picture of this future world, which is as in line as it gets looking at the current climate of geopolitics or whatever. Now, while I genuinely enjoyed playing the game, more than I initially anticipated, there are quite a few problems I do have here. Like I mentioned, there is a real disconnect between the gameplay and the story. The other NPCs who work in your sector regularly talk about how shit life is working here, how long it will take to get out of debt if that's even a realistic possibility in the first place, stuff like that. But one shift can easily net you 5 million credits, with your debt being 1.25 billion. So, if we take that average of about 5 million per shift to make it easy, that's 240 shifts to fully repay that debt, not counting interest or other costs. But even then, if we count one shift as being one real-life day, this makes repaying your debt within a year a genuinely easy target to hit, even without the massive debt layoff you get through the story. Sure, you can twist this like, oh, the player character is always super based and is uniquely talented and is the best ship cutter in 100 years, whatever. And the way that the other NPCs just fawn over you for no reason whatsoever kind of makes it sound like you're a real ship-breaking machine, you know, like the chosen one of shipbreakers. But still, it is kind of hard to potentially feel bad about an insurmountable debt that I was happily and steadily chipping away at and actually thinking, yeah, I could definitely just clear this debt after a few hours of gameplay. Every morning, you get a message saying if you don't pay on time, you'll get punished or whatever. But even if you don't make enough to cover your daily costs, it doesn't matter, you don't get punished for anything. Whenever Hal, the administrator, goes sicko mode and calls you out on picking up ship repair parts, there's nothing preventing you from still picking those parts up or ripping them out of valuable salvage, even if your ship is MIA for the time being. Now, I do really like the concept of this game. Breaking apart spaceships in orbit is just so fucking cool to me. And I get that a big part of the gameplay here is related to the story with the evil mega corporation and the union busting and blah blah blah. I'd rather see something unique and interesting that's not a bunch of NPCs falling in love with you for doing or saying literally nothing, with the story just happening around you while you try to work. The story as a whole is nothing new, you're just a cog in the machine. You can get as many stickers on your tools as you experience health and safety guideline violations, and corporate starts panting down your neck. The megacorp using the spare system gets advertised as a massive positive for the workers, because they, in theory at least, get revived when they die, even though if you ignore the whole thing about what consciousness is and the copy-paste versus the cut-paste issues, the only reason they even implement this system is because it's easier and cheaper to replace a worker with a carbon copy instead of recruiting and training a brand new one. The aspect I would like to talk about most here is probably the challenge of the game, as well as the difficulty. To put semantics out of the way, I'll refer to difficulty as the physical constraints of the game itself, like enemy health and damage, the raw numbers, or in this case, limited respawns and a shift timer, while challenge is the perceived experience through that difficulty. To make it simple, you can challenge yourself by raising the difficulty, but you can't difficult yourself by raising the challenge, if that makes sense. Anyways, in Hardspace Shipbreaker, there's 4 difficulty levels. The intended one, I assume, gives you a 15-minute shift timer, unlimited respawns, and a limited oxygen supply on top of that, which shaves off precious seconds of that shift timer, since you have to go out of your way to resupply your oxygen as well as thruster fuel, but you use a lot less thruster fuel than oxygen. The easiest difficulty removes the shift timer and allows you to turn off the oxygen mechanic if you want to, with the 2 harder difficulties reducing your allowed respawns to 30 and 0 respectively. Now me, outside of the class 2 reactor tutorial and killing myself a few times for an achievement, I think I died less than 10 times overall, with about 5 of those times not feeling fair. So the limited respawns aren't that big of a challenge bump, except the permadeath one. I also wouldn't recommend playing permadeath because I don't think it would be very fun to play, as, like I just mentioned, some of those deaths felt very unfair, like being crushed by a thruster you're dismantling in less than a second. So what I would like to focus on here when it comes to difficulty is the shift timer. In short, the shift timer doesn't matter, but more about that later. Like most games, Hardspace sees you managing resources. you'd be forgiven for thinking money is a resource here, but it's really not. You start with a massive debt of 1.25 billion, as we've already mentioned, and anything you buy, be it new spares after you die, oxygen refills, thruster fuel, feather supplies, demolition supplies, whatever, it just gets added to that debt. So it has no real meaning because you don't get punished for adding more debt to your debt. Even if you earn less than your daily cost after a shift, it's no big deal. The only thing that really changes is the amount of interest you have to pay, which is I think about 0.01% every day, which is a pretty hefty chunk at the beginning of the game, of course. But finishing the story wipes away like 1 billion credits of debt in one fell swoop, at which point I was a few million in the green already. When you reach that point at the end of the story, which is tied to your license level for the most part, you can spend your Lynx tokens to actually buy your gear so you don't have to pay rental fees anymore. But again, this doesn't actually matter in the long run, especially because the long run is already over at that point. It's just something to dump your Lynx tokens in if you've already bought all your upgrades. I genuinely think that making this game more of a hybrid between actual shipbreaking and some kind of secondary management tycoon simulator would have made it a lot more engaging. Like the little side quest of repairing the ship Weaver gives you is cool, makes you look at what ships you want to salvage in function of the parts they contain, and you could make this an entire separate part of the game, with you repairing ships for clients or whatever, using the money you earn as a profit to buy, I don't know, cool upgrades for your shop. Even without adding an entire secondary gameplay loop to the game, you could still do something interesting with money. Either allow players to actually spend it on more than just your consumables, stuff like buying posters instead of just finding them in the ships, being able to pimp out your app or whatever, buy a snake minigame to play on your terminal, I don't fucking know. With the way that works, this wouldn't be a real challenge though, so you could change it up that you start with a balance of 0, but still have those daily costs, still have to pay off your debt, which means you would actually feel it when you end the day in the red, or something along those lines, Obviously this would take a lot of work, but I do think it would make the game a lot better overall, a lot more engaging than just salvaging ships and everything else being a nuisance. The actual resources you have to manage on a macro scale in these games are those Lynx tokens which you use for buying upgrades and your shift timer, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. You earn those Lynx tokens by reaching those salvage goals, where you have to correctly salvage a percentage of a ship's value, which we've already been through, and the LT rewards for these salvage goals scale up. So, if you salvage half a ship in a single shift, it's more cost efficient to finish salvaging it rather than starting a new one every single shift. But the problem here is that the shift timer doesn't actually have any real meaning. Sure, it subconsciously pressures you into working faster and trying to get the final salvage goals with 2 minutes on the clock, and being wilder with the volatile salvage can result in some fun shenanigans, but the only thing that happens after a shift is over is having to pay about 500 gain costs, allowing you to spend some LT tokens and then just continue on to a new shift. On average, like I said, I'd make about 5 million per shift, depending on the type of ship and whatnot. So again, and I really want to hammer this home, the money isn't a factor here. The 15-minute timer seems a bit arbitrary, and after playing through the game again without the timer, made me reflect on the whole concept of difficulty versus tedium. Is tedium a valid form of difficulty? I think this has been a hotly debated question over the years with no real answer to it in my opinion, because it can be very hard to differentiate the two. Take Dark Souls for example. I know, very original. You could argue that after dying to a boss fight and respawning at a bonfire and having to run all the way back to the boss is a form of tedium, right? Especially considering the stakes of Marika they added in Elden Ring to specifically remove that specific tedium. But oftentimes boss runs are a challenge in itself, having the choice of either fighting the enemies you encounter or running through those enemies, being not too careless so you don't lose your souls by dying again before you can actually reclaim them. But the main difference here is that you can actually lose progress through dying on the way to the boss in Dark Souls, while there is no loss of progress dying in Hardspace Shipbreaker. Dying in Hardspace doesn't do or add anything on the gameplay side except maybe counting down the clock until game over when you only have a limited amount of respawns, like in the original Super Mario games. When the foundations of challenge in a game like this are so relatively wonky, it makes it really hard to care about playing through that challenge in my mind. This is all about the extrinsic motivation of the game, of course. You still have your intrinsic motivation of wanting to clear X amount of salvage goals in a single shift, or clear a ship in X amount of shifts, or not wanting to die because you have to admit you've been a bad boy, so you feel a little bit bad because of it. But fundamentally, the game feels exactly the same with or without the shift timer. The timer just adds a mandatory break every 15 minutes, which, if you haven't earned enough LTs to get any upgrades, haven't advanced the license level to unlock new stuff, or haven't reached the point where you need to repair your tools, it just breaks up the flow of the game, as you sit through 2 loading screens and some wonky ass menus to get back to the point you were at less than a minute ago. But of course, all of this can simply be ignored by playing on OpenShift difficulty, where you're not bothered with a mandatory timer at all. And you can always just quit the shift on your own at any point, so it really doesn't matter that much. The timer is an optional, self-imposed challenge in this way, and the game certainly was fine while playing with the timer, but I personally enjoyed it more without the timer, though maybe that was because I already knew what I was doing. In general, there's not really a massive amount of replay value after you've seen all ship types and finished up the story. There's only 4 ship classes or manufacturers, with each class having multiple variations, and 1 other ship class that doesn't have any variations. But even then, every ship has some random aspects to it, like the location of the reactor, or the location of other subsystems, or just the general layout of the ship itself. I do think adding 1 extra big ship class with its own variations would be perfect when it comes to variety. In my opinion, it just misses a little bit of extra spice on that front. An easy ship class to add would be something like a luxury cruiser, with more wavy and decadent architecture instead of the blocky pragmatic look all the other ships adhere to. Or something like a military ship, which could have its own type of military hazards tied to it. There are scout craft in the game, but these don't have any weapons, so I'm thinking more something in the lines of a destroyer type ship, instead of just a scouting ship. But I have no clue whether there are any content updates planned for this game after its release out of early access, which is already about a year ago. Supposedly a challenge mode, contests and user-generated content were planned for full release, and there is a daily ship salvage challenge with a leaderboard in the game already, which kind of ticks off 2 of those boxes, but especially the focus on user-generated content would be a huge boon for the game. Just let the players design their own ships, right? Just put a ship builder in the game, make the players have the freedom to design their own ships, which they can put on the workshop and they get rated, and you can, the best ones and the worst ones, whatever. It's been done before, The game did sell quite well, according to some articles I read. So one can only hope they'll continue updating the game, though I don't really see it happening, sadly. Because I do think the foundation of the game is definitely worth expanding on, whether it be with content updates or a sequel, or I don't know. But aside from all of these pretty minor gripes I have with the game overall, and the rare frame hiccups and other technical issues I had, I genuinely enjoyed playing this game for the 30+ hours I put into it over like 2 weeks' time. It's an intriguing concept in a relatively interesting setting, and it very much feels authentic to play. Dropping into work at a massive tanker for the first time was an absolute joy, and just the ships with all of their hazards usually present enough of a challenge and diversity to stay interesting enough to work on for an extended length of time. And whenever you strip off the outsides and start cutting up the final parts, just the satisfaction of a job well done usually did it for me. Like I shortly mentioned somewhere in the beginning, this game was largely inspired by real-life shipbreakers in specifically India, and I found a cool website to go through if you're interested about a real-world inspiration for this game. You could also play Ship Graveyard Simulator, I guess, if you want to experience it for yourself, but from what I've played of just the demo of the second game, which is slated to release this year I think, it was infinitely more tedious and annoying than playing Hardspace Shipbreaker. So with all of that said, I do recommend this game because I genuinely enjoyed playing the game even with the issues I have listed, provided it looks interesting to you, of course. I have a feeling that's basically what I say at the end of every video, but still. I personally got it on sale for like 17.5 euros back when it was still in early access, and it definitely was money well spent. I hope you enjoyed this video that was largely a rant about difficulty in a game that wasn't even that difficult to begin with. I also hope it was a bit easy to follow because I chopped a little bit in the script and in the audio editing, so I hope everything was clear to you. I also want to express my genuine thanks to everyone for the crazy amount of response to my last video on World of Warcraft vs Final Fantasy XIV as a casual player. It was really humbling and really cool to see and read all of the very interesting and heartfelt comments. So I really want to thank you for that. That really made my week, really made my month even, you know. It was a really, really fun experience. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the support. So join me next time for another video on another game, most likely. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in that next video. See ya.
Just promise me one thing. When you get to wherever it is you're going, you send me a postcard. Weave around.